Very sorry for that. All right, let's get started. Thank you for coming today and listening to this presentation on the circular flow update, a new model for a modern economy. As you know, I'm a professor at Nyack College. As of last week, I'm now professor emeritus. And I've taught this course many times over the past 15 years. And it usually starts in the first chapter. This is on, of course, in Principles of Economics. We start with a model of how the economy works. It's the circular flow model. This was introduced in its more or less modern form back in the 1920s and 30s by Professor Frank Knight. And it has its roots going all the way back to the French physiocrats in the 1700s. I'm not going to spend any time on it. It's still a very useful model, and I teach from it. But it has some significant shortcomings, as you would expect from a model that's 100 years old. The economy has changed tremendously in the past 100 years. So these are what I see as the main shortcomings of the circular flow diagram as a model of the economy. First of all, it ignores the government role in the economy. It has households and firms, but governments play a huge role in the modern economy, much more significant than they were in the 1920s. Arguably 40 to 50% of economic activity in the economy is driven by government action. So it's hard to it's just not right to leave the government out of a model of the economy. Also, the circular flow model does not explain how we get capital accumulation. There's no mechanism in that model for increasing capital growth and anything that's dynamic. It is a very stagnant equilibrium-based model. It focuses only on production and consumption, and it's very much rooted in the present. It's about what takes place today and does not look forward. So because of these shortcomings, I believe that we need a new teaching model of the economy. Or at least an additional teaching model. As I say, I continue to use the circular flow model in my classes, but I move quickly on to this production, property, and power model. So the production, property, and power model is this new model for the new economy, or the current economy. And it includes some features that are not in the circular flow model. It includes people, right? There's the circular flow model is a plumbing model. It's about the circular flow of water, if you will, or money. And certainly there is this metaphor of money flows, but the economy is really about people. It's not about plumbing. And so the production, property, and power model features people, and people make economic choices as they try to respond the best they can to things that happen in their life. The production, property, and power model has 3 cycles of economic activity that are interrelated and in effect interact with each other. There's a production cycle, a property cycle, and a power cycle. Hence the name production, property, and power. So there's these 3 cycles of economic activity, not just the one cycle of the circular flow model. The model includes psychological forces which motivate people as they make economic decisions, right? That's why it's important that we have people in the model. Or rather said another way, since we have people in the model, since the economy is composed of people, then we have psychological forces because people are motivated in many different ways. And it includes the human-driven dynamic of economic growth. And so we can now talk about economic growth using our production, property, and power model. So there's 3 cycles of economic activity. As I said, the production consumption cycle, that's essentially what the old circular flow diagram shows. There's a savings and investment cycle. That's where we get economic growth, and we also get a lot of disruption in the economy. And then there's a government tax and spend cycle. Okay, and we're going to look at each of these 3 cycles. For each of these 3 cycles, there are conflicting and balancing motivational, what I call force fields. And these forces push against each other and ultimately guide the economy to rebalance. In the production and consumption cycle, we have the forces of supply and demand, market forces that are equilibrated or balanced through prices. In the savings and investment cycle, the property cycle, we have the forces of fear and greed. And these forces are equilibrated or balanced through the price mechanism of interest rates. And then in the government tax and spending cycle, we have the urge for power, which comes through money, through resources, and the aversion to paying taxes that is balancing and offsetting the urge for power. And that is balanced and equilibrated through the price mechanism of tax rates. Okay, so these are this is the essential setup of the model. And now let's look a little bit more. It's a teaching model, so it's obviously not going to be explaining everything. It gives a visual framework. So you'll see it's very much a visual model, and that helps to support this mental model that we're building of how the economy works. There's 4 representative people in our economy. There's Jack, Tom, Janet, and Sam. Jack stands for, well, I got the names from again, mental models. Jack is Jack Armstrong, the All-American man, or the All-American boy, which if you're my age, you might remember hearing about Jack Armstrong, but I'm sure that our students have never, ever heard of Jack Armstrong. But anyway, Jack is our consumer. He's our representative household head, and that's one of the 4 characters. Tom is from Thomas Edison. Tom is an entrepreneur. He's an innovator, and is a source of ideas for new and innovative improvements to the economy. Janet is our banker, and you can tell how old this model is because at the time I developed it, Janet Yellen was the chair of the Fed. So Janet represents the banking or financial intermediary sector of the economy, not the central bank. It's just the regular old bank, but I borrowed Janet Yellen's name. And Sam represents Uncle Sam. So these are the 4 characters. The household represented by Jack, the entrepreneurs represented by Tom, the banking system or the financial intermediaries represented by Janet, and government represented by Sam. Okay. Notice, well, you won't notice, but missing in this model is an explicit depiction of markets, and the answer is that markets are implicit to the model because markets are really the idea of learning. It's where buyers and sellers interact and learn from each other and find their way to making transactions. It's not so much, well, in some ways it's an institution, but it's more of a pervasive environment in which the economy operates. All right, we're going to take a little deeper dive into our model here and look at each of the people. We've got Jack, an all-American boy. Jack is motivated by the enjoyment of consumption and leisure. He dislikes fear and anxiety, and he seeks security in property, that is through savings, physical and financial savings. And he cares about his future household. So one of the real shortcomings of the circular flow model is that it was very present oriented, and this model is very future oriented. Jack cares about his future and the future of his household. And some of the things that Jack does is he chooses what to buy or not to buy, what to say, how much to save or not, and how much to work or not. And in making these choices, Jack balances the enjoyment of spending against the anxiety of not saving enough, and the enjoyment of leisure against the rewards of working longer hours, or the rewards that can be derived from the income that he makes for working longer hours. Okay, so with these themes of forward-looking, of having psychological motivations, and having a balance, and this constant ebb and flow between the forces is a key part of the teaching model. Here's Tom. He's an entrepreneur, and Tom is the rock star of the production, property, and power model. Tom is motivated by profit. He believes his innovation will increase profitability or improve or create future profitability. He's also motivated by the fear of competition, somebody else taking his markets away. And he's also motivated by just the sheer joy of creative activity. He implements innovative ideas and change. And important concepts related to Tom's work are the work of creative destruction. And this is essentially the idea of how we achieve economic growth and improvements in our standard of living as the new and better replaces the old and obsolete. And to some extent, the idea of animal spirits, although that's more related to the funding side. Tom balances the rewards of innovation, that is profitability and psychological satisfaction of creativity, against the cost of failure. And the higher the interest rate, the greater the cost of failure and the likelihood of the cost of failure. And here's Janet, our banker, and Janet is reviewing the loan application documents, and she's holding up the document with an approved stamp on it. And Janet is motivated by profit, making good loans, and trying to avoid losses from bad loans. The bank aggregates savings from households and invests those savings into business investments. And their job is to select good investments, good projects to finance. Good for the bank, right? Not necessarily good for the society, but good for the bank. The hope is that is well aligned with what's good for society. Concepts here: due diligence, animal spirits, and the idea of a financial intermediary. And the financial intermediary closes that gap between the supply of funds, that is the household savings, and the demand for funds, that is the investment made by entrepreneurs. And so the bank and Janet plays an important role. And our fourth represented person in this model is Sam, the politician. And Sam is motivated by the urge for power and to be in control, and his desire to implement his agenda to do good. The government provides justice and security. It taxes the economy to get the funds to carry out their agenda. And it enforces laws and regulations with police power. So the concept here is that there's a constraining force, and the constraining force is provided by the tax aversion behavior of taxpayers, as illustrated in the Laffer curve. Unfortunately, but it is what it is. Politicians tend to be somewhat short-sighted, focused on the next election. And they're also self-interested, possibly with some public-mindedness as well. Sam balances the need for tax revenues, right? That's what he needs. That's his source of power. So he needs tax revenue to power his agenda, but he has to balance that against the likely adverse reaction of people as they try to avoid taxes. And so, again, we have this tension and this balance between the motivating forces. All right, so let's look at our cycles, our three economic cycles. Here we have the production cycle, and this looks very much like the circular flow diagram, because that's what it is. The household purchases consumer goods from the consumer good factory. This is the consumer good factory. And the consumer good factory pays wages, rents, and dividends, which become income to the household. So you have this circular flow. And there's a little side flow here that I put in because later on I want to talk about capital investments. But the business, the consumer factory, needs to buy materials and equipment and other capital goods. And so it does business purchases from capital goods factories who then provide jobs, wages, and dividends to the owners who are living in households. So you have this circular flow with this little side flow out to the capital goods. That's essentially the circular flow diagram. And again, this is all about consumption and production and forces of supply and demand and prices, bringing balance into that cycle. So moving on to the property cycle. The property cycle has two parts. It has a savings part and it has an investment part, just like the production cycle had firms and households. So we also have in the property cycle two halves. So this is the consumer half, the household side. And here we have Jack, and he's trying to decide to spend or to save, right? He's balancing that choice. And part of his thinking is about a future household. So here we have in this shaded future household, and Jack is thinking about his future, and that influences decision on how much to save in a nest egg. And the nest egg is really transporting purchasing power to a future household. That's the purpose of saving. And but in fact, what his savings is doing is being made available to the present economy, but it's so that at some point in the future he could liquidate that property and use it for future households. Now, it's a fact that households sometimes borrow money, so they're dissaving, they're spending more than they're saving, so that would involve a consumer loan, and they're borrowing from future households because essentially that it's a future household that's going to pay that back. So this is the consumer half of the property cycle, and we'll treat the consumer loan as a negative savings. And so the net savings is what goes into the financial system for our purposes here. Okay, so that's the savings side. And now we get the investment side. And here on the investment side of the property cycle, we have the entrepreneur, and he's got an idea for an innovation. But that idea is expected to lead to future profits. So here we have shaded this idea of a future factory making profitable goods. And he needs to turn that idea into reality. So in order to do that, he's going to need money, resources, to purchase capital goods to make his innovation a reality. And so he gets that money from two sources, some from the retained earnings of the existing firm. So whatever the existing firm does not spend in wages, rents, and dividends and pay to the household, it can reinvest in innovation. And then in addition to the retained earnings, which are reinvested, he can also apply to the bank for a new business loan and acquire investable funds. Those investable funds then are spent at a capital goods factory to purchase the capital goods and set up the production lines to make his new idea a reality. And of course, the capital goods factory, as it spends those investable funds, that creates jobs, pays rents and dividends to the household, which becomes income. All right, so that's the second half of the property cycle. So now we have to put the thing together. So we have the complete cycle, and it looks like this. And notice that all of a sudden we have a bank in the picture, right? So we have the consumer half, which generates savings. We have the investor half, which requires new business loans, but we needed that bank in the middle, that intermediary, to close the gap between the investor and the saver. And the bank's job is to do due diligence and to approve good loans and not approve bad loans. Okay, so that's our property cycle. So again, the money flows out of the household through the bank into the entrepreneur's hands, who spends it at the capital goods factory, creating jobs, paying rents and dividends, and the money flows back to the household income. So we get that cycle of economic activity. Whoops. And let's see, now we get to our third cycle, which is the power cycle. And we'll look at first the balanced budget version. So here's our household, and the household pays taxes to the government. And the government uses that money for either purchases as it carries out its government functions. So it has to buy, computers and police cars and build, schools and courts and the other stuff, and B-1 bombers and things like that. And it also uses some of the money for social spending, which goes to certain households. And so it's a very straightforward cycle. Taxes come out, comes back into the economy through wages, rent, dividends, or through social spending. And it's balanced, okay? Now, one thing you should note here is that I have taxes being paid by households, not by governments, not by firms. And that is because while firms collect taxes, the burden of that tax falls on households, because the tax on corporations is a tax on consumers, it's a tax on workers, and it's a tax on owners. The burden of that tax falls on either the consumer, the worker, the owner, or more likely all three. But all three of those, the consumer, the worker, and the household owner, they all live in households. So for simplicity, I just say, look, the burden of taxes is on the household. So let's just show the taxes coming from the households to the government and then back into the economy. But as we know, the government doesn't balance its budget, so we need a budget deficit version. And so here's the budget deficit version of the power cycle. We have taxes and we have the spending, but we also have additional money coming out of the financial system as the government borrows to finance its deficit. And essentially, it's borrowing against the credit worthiness of future governments. So they're borrowing from future governments the purchasing power to be spent by the current government. Okay, so that's the idea of the um, power cycle. All right, so we can put all the pieces together. These three cycles are interconnected and they act on each other. So all of our cycles, well, we don't see all the cycles yet, but all of the cycles are communicating with each other. And so here we have the complete picture of the model. We have the production cycle here. We have the savings and investment cycle here. And then we have the power cycle here. And you can see that they all have points of interaction and interconnection. So there's multiple forces at work. It creates tension. The system tends to a balance of forces. As these forces of fear and greed and supply and demand and urge for power and the aversion to paying taxes, as all of these forces work against each other and balance each other, we get a balance of forces and an unstable stability, unstable equilibrium is the result. And we can define that equilibrium negatively by saying that firms in the equilibrium, firms are unable to increase their profitability. Households are unwilling to work any more hours or to spend any more at the supermarket or to increase their savings. They are at the point that they are unwilling to increase any of those decisions. Banks are unwilling to lend anymore at the current interest rate. Entrepreneurs don't want to borrow anymore at the current interest rate. Government doesn't want to raise taxes, and they're unwilling to increase debt. Or we can be more positive about things. We can say that firms have maximized their profits. Households have maximized their pleasure of consumption and enjoyment of savings and security. Banks have loaned out everything they can at the current interest rates. Entrepreneurs have financed all the projects that they want to at the current interest rates. And politicians have found the optimal tax rate. Right, so that would be our equilibrium. So that's the production, property, and power model. It's a treetop view of the whole economy. It illustrates many connections in the economy. It allows us to analyze public policy proposals by looking at the entire picture and how a public policy proposal would affect the whole economy, not just the little marginal effect that we usually look at, because we can see the connections as one area of the economy gets affected by public policy, then we can see the ripple effects through the rest of the economy. So this mental model, this framework, helps businesses, financial managers, politicians, and students plan for adjustments to specific events or actions. So here's the final picture, and yeah, that's it's hard to read it, but that's the full size. Okay, well, we managed, even with a kind of a messy start, we managed to get to the end. So I'll open the time up for any questions if anyone has any questions on this new model of the modern economy. Okay. So I'm not hearing anything.
It doesn't look like we have any questions that have come through. So if anyone does have any questions, feel free to throw them in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen, and we'll be happy to answer any of the questions that you might have.
Okay.
We'll give you a few more minutes if you want to type up your questions, if you have anything to ask. We will sit around, wait for a few more minutes to make sure that if you do have any questions, we can answer them for you.
It's a lot like my students. So one thing I often do with my students to help them learn how to use this model is I'll walk them through a particular public policy um, and how that would affect the economy. And I like to use Social Security as an example because I'm familiar with it. And the students generally are familiar with it as well. And I show how an increase in Social Security would cause an increase in Social Security taxes, which would drain money out of the household, and that would affect the decision that households have to make between saving and consumption on the remaining money, and that because Social Security is going to increase their retirement income, then that means that they don't have to save as much for retirement, so they'll offset the higher taxes by lowering their savings rate. So it won't affect their consumption very much. It'll reduce their savings. So that reduced savings will mean that there's less money available for banks to lend to entrepreneurs. That means entrepreneurs will have fewer projects that they can fund. And so there'll be fewer innovations that enter into the economy. And of course, each innovation is an improvement, making life better. Otherwise, it's a failed innovation and it's a failed investment. So in general, we would expect that business investments are successful because they're meeting a real need and they're improving lives. So that means that there's less money available to generate innovation and life improvement. And so our standard of living will not increase as rapidly as savings decreases. It'll also cause an increase in interest rates and other things, but that way, so they get to see the ripple effects through the economy. Well,
All right. I'm not seeing any more questions, but I think that was really helpful and a really good kind of wrap up to what you were saying and a good way to form a thought on what you just presented about, because it can be a lot taking this new way of thinking and kind of putting it in your brain and setting it up that way. So I appreciate that kind of thought-provoking way of looking at things. Do you have anything else to add or anything else that you want to say about your presentation? It was really interesting.
okay, just one final comment.
Yeah.
The model shows how the markets and the economy deals with fiscal policy, government fiscal policy, but it doesn't have anything to say about monetary policy. So you'll notice there's nothing in here that about central banks or inflation or anything like that. And that means that there is implicitly an assumption in the model that we're dealing with what I call sound money, money that's not inflated, that holds its value year after year, which is not a realistic assumption, but again, it's only a model. So just be aware that the model does not address monetary policy issues. So that's it.
Yeah. Well, wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you for presenting. It was, like I said, very interesting. So this was the circular flow model in a modern economy. And our presenter today was Professor Gordon Barno. So just as a reminder, we will be emailing everyone a link to view the recording of this webinar once it is available. And Please let us know if there's anything else we can help you with. I am linking a few things in the chat below to all of our other learning and growing webinars. And if you have an idea for a webinar that you would like to present, I'm also linking that as well if you ever need it. So I'm going to paste that in right now for you guys if you want to take in any of those links. And with that, we are wrapping up, and please, everyone, have a wonderful rest of your day. And thank you again so much for presenting for us today, Professor Barno. I really enjoyed it. And thank you everyone for attending today. Have a wonderful rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.